The first thing I noticed was how quiet the space had become. Not empty, efficient. Systems activated only when needed. Lights no longer followed me continuously. They turned on in sections I was expected to enter next. When I didn't, they turned off without hesitation. The building wasn't waiting anymore. It was sequencing. I tried to interrupt it by changing pace, walking slower, then faster. The response didn't adjust. Doors opened on schedule, not on proximity. Elevators arrived at fixed intervals, regardless of whether I was there. I began missing them consistently, like I was out of sync with something I couldn't see. Screens updated with instructions that expired before I reached them. By the time I arrived, the interface had already reset, ready for the next cycle. I checked a corridor that used to respond instantly to my presence. It stayed dark until a soft mechanical sound passed through the walls, like something moving ahead of me. Then the lights turned on in sequence, receding away from where I stood. The space wasn't reacting to me anymore. It was advancing without me. I realized then that whatever version it had remembered wasn't just compliant. It was punctual, and everything now operated on the assumption that I would arrive exactly when expected. Any delay wasn't corrected. It was skipped. I tried to reinsert myself into the schedule. I waited near a junction where multiple routes overlapped, hoping proximity would force a response. Nothing acknowledged me. The space continued executing its sequence elsewhere. I could hear it now. Soft mechanical transitions, doors cycling, elevators departing, all of it happening slightly out of reach. When I moved toward the sound, it shifted forward, maintaining the same distance, like a process advancing just ahead of my position. I passed a directory panel that used to update dynamically. It displayed a completed route, marked in solid lines, starting and ending at points I recognized. My location wasn't shown. There was no marker indicating delay or deviation, just completion. I followed the path anyway. The lights guided me at first, then stopped halfway through. Beyond that point, the corridor was already lit, as if someone had passed moments earlier. I checked the timestamps on nearby systems, all synchronized, all current, none aligned with my presence. When I reached the end of the route, the final door was already closed and sealed, not locked, finished. I placed my hand against it and felt vibration on the other side, steady and distant, like operations continuing without interruption. The space hadn't failed to notice me. It had already accounted for a version of me that arrived on time, and everything else was proceeding under the assumption that version was enough. I started seeing timestamps where reflections should have been. Polished surfaces no longer showed me consistently. Sometimes they displayed a corridor already in motion, doors opening and closing in sequence. Sometimes they showed nothing at all. When I stopped in front of one panel and waited, the image updated without my movement. A shadow crossed the frame at my usual height and pace. The space reacted to it immediately. Lights advanced. Systems engaged. I followed, staying deliberately out of sync. The reaction slowed, then stabilized again, maintaining rhythm without me. I realized the system wasn't blind to delay. It was tolerant of absence. In several rooms, chairs were pulled out. Consoles were warmed to the touch. Interfaces displayed confirmation screens that faded as I approached. Everything suggested recent use, but nothing required continuation. I checked a service monitor mounted low on the wall. It listed active processes, all marked as ongoing. None referenced a user, only a schedule. I waited long enough for one cycle to complete. When it did, the system logged success and immediately began the next. There was no pause for verification, no check for presence. I understood then that the space no longer needed confirmation. The remembered version didn't have to arrive anymore. It had already been reduced to timing, and timing, once established, didn't require a body to maintain it. That's when the space began reallocating around me. Areas I lingered and lost priority. Lights dimmed permanently. Systems delayed their responses, not as a warning, but as a downgrade. Meanwhile, sections I avoided became increasingly active. I could hear synchronized movement behind walls I no longer passed. Airflow redirected itself, pulling sound away from me. I entered a control room that had always responded instantly to motion. The panels remained dark until a sequence began elsewhere, then briefly lit as if acknowledging a completed step. I wasn't part of the trigger. I was residual. I checked a status display near the entrance. It listed capacity values, throughput, optimization metrics. One line updated as I stood there. Input variance detected. Mitigation applied. The environment adjusted subtly. Pressure equalized. Noise level stabilized. My presence was being absorbed, not addressed. I tested it by moving erratically, breaking any remaining pattern. The system didn't chase. It smoothed. Delays increased until my actions became statistically irrelevant. I wasn't disrupting anything. I was being averaged out. The space didn't need to remove me to function. It only needed to reduce me below the threshold where response was required. And once that threshold was crossed, nothing I did produced a meaningful reaction anymore. After that, I stopped testing the system and started observing the gaps it left behind. Entire sections of the building fell into a kind of low-power state whenever I entered them. Not shut down, deprioritized. Interfaces loaded slowly, then not at all. Audio cues triggered late or out of sequence. Meanwhile, distant areas I could no longer reach operated at full capacity. I could hear them clearly now. Rhythmic, efficient, alive in a way the space around me wasn't anymore. I followed the sound until the floor markers changed color beneath my feet. The transition was subtle, but deliberate. Beyond that point, my presence no longer registered. Motion sensors didn't trigger. Doors stayed neutral. I walked through a corridor that had once adjusted to every step. Nothing responded. The lights ahead remained on, but they weren't for me. They advanced at a fixed pace, maintaining distance, like a procession I wasn't part of. I found a terminal still active within the downgraded zone. It displayed a simple status line, repeating every few seconds. Secondary input detected. No action required. I stood there long enough for it to cycle multiple times. The message didn't change. The space wasn't failing. It had already accounted for me as an excess variable, something present, but no longer influential enough to matter. I noticed the schedule tightening after that. Transitions happened faster. Cycles shortened. The space began compressing its operations, as if preparing to run without tolerance for drift. Doors no longer stayed open after a sequence completed. They closed immediately, sealing outcomes in place. Elevators departed the moment they arrived, never waiting. Screens flashed instructions for fractions of a second. Enough to be executed, not enough to be read. I tried positioning myself directly in the path of one cycle. I stood where a door was scheduled to open. It didn't stop. The mechanism activated anyway, forcing the panel past me with steady pressure. Not aggressive, not cautious. It wasn't designed to account for obstruction. I stepped aside before it completed the motion. The system logged no interruption. In a nearby room, I watched the full process complete without a single pause. Initiation, execution, closure. No verification step, no fallback. I checked the status panel at the edge of the corridor. Optimization phase active. Latency tolerance reduced. Variance margin minimized. The space was no longer adapting. It was finalizing. I understood then that whatever version of me had been remembered wasn't just punctual or compliant. It was no longer required to exist. The system had distilled behavior down to timing alone. And once timing became precise enough, the presence that originally created it stopped being necessary at all. I stopped hearing individual actions and started hearing continuity instead. The space no longer sounded like separate systems operating. It moved as one process, smooth and uninterrupted. Even when I stood still, The rhythm continued elsewhere, perfectly timed. I followed it as far as I could, until the architecture itself changed. Corridors narrowed slightly, ceilings lowered just enough to feel intentional, not hostile, optimized. The environment wasn't closing in, it was converging. I reached a junction that no longer offered alternatives. Every path ahead led to the same destination, regardless of direction. The indicators confirmed it. Multiple routes, single outcome. I checked the nearest control surface. It no longer displayed live data, only a summary. Process stabilized, sequence locked, all variables resolved. My presence wasn't listed as an exception. It wasn't listed at all. I waited for something to react to that realization. Nothing did. The space had already moved past the point where acknowledgement mattered. Whatever role I had played in shaping its behavior was complete. Not removed, not rejected, concluded. I wasn't standing inside an active system anymore. I was standing next to one that no longer needed to consider me as part of its operation. I stayed where I was because there was nothing left to follow. The rhythm continued without approaching or retreating. It didn't acknowledge distance anymore. Lights remained on in places I wasn't going to reach. Doors opened and closed on schedule, precise and indifferent. The space no longer adjusted around me. It no longer corrected errors or compensated for delay. It behaved as if the sequence had already passed through completely. I tried moving once more, slowly, carefully. Nothing responded. Not resistance. Not assistance. Just continuity elsewhere. I checked one last surface, not expecting data. It showed a completed cycle, time-stamped and archived. The time matched the present. The action didn't. I understood then that the space wasn't waiting for me to leave. It had already moved on. I wasn't excluded. I was leftover. An earlier condition that no longer applied. The building stayed active, stable, and uninterrupted, carrying forward a process that no longer required my presence to exist. When the lights finally dimmed around me, it wasn't a shutdown. It was a transition. The system didn't end. It simply continued without needing to remember me anymore.